In the divorce, my wife got everything, and I ended up living on the streets. While I was digging through the trash for food, she drove by with her new boyfriend, 30 years younger, and mocked. That crumb picker was my biggest mistake. He looked at me, recognized my face, and said, "You have an unknown son in Houston? Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from." I never thought I'd be picking through garbage at 63 years old. The smell of rotting food mixed with the autumn rain makes my stomach turn, but hunger is stronger than pride. That's something I learned 18 months ago when my world collapsed in a divorce court. My name is Charles, and I used to have a life. A house on Maple Street with a garden I tended every weekend. A bank account with $47,000. A wife who smiled at me across the breakfast table every morning for 12 years. Now I have a cardboard sign that reads, "Anything helps," and clothes that haven't been washed in 3 days. Addison made sure of that. The divorce papers still echo in my mind sometimes. Due to the defendant's demonstrated financial incompetence and unstable behavior. Financial incompetence. That's what she called it when I lost my job at the printing company. Unstable behavior. That's what she called my depression when I couldn't find work for 8 months. Her lawyer was sharp. Mine was overwhelmed and underpaid. She got the house, the savings, even my father's watch. The judge looked at me like I was some kind of deadbeat who'd been hiding assets. I tried to explain that I'd worked for 32 years, that I'd never missed a mortgage payment until the layoff started. But somehow Addison had documentation showing I'd made reckless financial decisions. Bills I didn't remember approving. Investments I never made. I should have fought harder. I should have questioned how she suddenly had all this evidence, but I was broken, tired, and honestly, I believed I deserved it. When someone tells you you're worthless enough times, you start to believe them. The shelter downtown has a waiting list 2 weeks long. The weather's getting colder, and my jacket has a tear near the left shoulder that lets the wind cut right through. I've learned which dumpsters behind restaurants might have something edible, which alleys are safest to sleep in, and how to avoid eye contact with people who used to know me. That's the worst part. Not the hunger, or the cold, or even the smell. It's the recognition in their eyes, followed immediately by the look away. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store where I shopped for years. Bob from the hardware store where I bought supplies for weekend projects. They see me, they know me, and they pretend they don't. But today was different. Today, the humiliation reached a new level. I was behind Angelo's Italian restaurant, going through their dumpster. Thursday is when they throw out the bread that's getting stale, and if I'm lucky, there might be some leftover pasta. My hands were deep in a garbage bag when I heard laughter. Rich, careless laughter that made my blood freeze. I turned around, and there she was. Addison, my ex-wife, walking arm in arm with a man who looked like he could be her son. He was handsome in that polished way, wearing clothes that probably cost more than I used to make in a week. His hair was perfectly styled, and he had the kind of confident smile that comes from never having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. Addison looked exactly the same. Blonde hair professionally maintained, makeup flawless, even at 3 in the afternoon. She was wearing a burgundy coat I'd never seen before, and diamond earrings that caught the sunlight. She looked happy, happier than I'd ever seen her during our marriage. They stopped walking when they spotted me. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the concrete, but there was nowhere to go. I was caught, literally with my hands in the garbage, by the woman who put me there. "Oh my God," Addison said, her voice carrying that false surprise she used to perfect for dinner parties. "Charles, is that really you?" I pulled my hands out of the dumpster, wiping them on my jeans. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding. "Hello, Addison." She looked me up and down, taking in my appearance. The stained clothes, the 3-day stubble, the smell I couldn't quite wash away at public restrooms. Her companion was staring too, but his expression was different. Less amused, more curious. "This is incredible," she continued, her voice getting louder. A few people across the street turned to look. "Patrick, I want you to meet someone very special. This man picking through garbage used to be my husband." The word husband came out like it tasted bad. Patrick shifted uncomfortably, but Addison wasn't finished. "Charles, meet Patrick. He's been wonderful company since my divorce was finalized. So much more mature than men his age usually are." She paused, letting that sink in. "Of course, he's still 30 years younger than you." I felt my face burning, not from anger, but from shame. Pure, overwhelming shame that seemed to start in my chest and spread outward until my whole body felt hot. "Addison, please," I managed to say. "Please what?" She stepped closer, and I could smell her perfume. The same one she wore when we were married, when she used to kiss me goodbye in the mornings. "Please don't tell the truth. Please don't mention that this Catador de Migajas was the biggest mistake of my life." The Spanish phrase hit me like a slap. She'd been taking Spanish lessons during our marriage, said it was for her book club. Catador de Migajas, collector of crumbs, scavenger. Patrick was watching this exchange with growing discomfort. His eyes kept moving between Addison and me, and I could see something working behind them. Recognition, maybe, or concern. "That's enough," he said quietly. But Addison was enjoying herself too much to stop. "Do you know what he told me when I divorced him? He said I was the best thing that ever happened to him. Can you imagine? This man thought I was the best thing in his pathetic little life." She laughed again, that same rich sound that had drawn me to her 12 years ago. Now it sounded like breaking glass. "I should have left him years earlier. What a waste of time." She turned to Patrick, her voice softening. "Thank God I have someone who actually appreciates me now." That's when Patrick did something unexpected. He stepped away from her, his eyes locked on my face. He studied me for a long moment, his expression growing more intense. "What's your full name?" he asked me directly. "Charles," I answered, confused. "Charles Morrison." Patrick went very still. Addison noticed and frowned. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked. Patrick ignored her, continuing to stare at me. "Where were you born, Charles?" "Houston," I said automatically. "Why?" I saw something change in Patrick's face. A kind of shock that started in his eyes and spread downward. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He took a step back from both of us. "Patrick?" Addison's voice had an edge now. "What's going on?" Patrick looked at her, then back at me. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You have a son you've never met, don't you? In Houston?" The world stopped spinning. The sounds of traffic faded away. Even Addison's sharp intake of breath seemed to come from very far away. I stared at this young man, who couldn't possibly know what he was asking, couldn't possibly be saying what I thought he was saying. But somehow, impossibly, he was. The garbage bag slipped from my hands and hit the pavement with a wet sound. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at this young man whose words had just turned my world upside down for the second time in 18 months. "What did you say?" My voice came out as a croak. Patrick's face had gone pale under his perfect tan. His hands were shaking now, and he kept looking back and forth between Addison and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle that was missing crucial pieces. "I asked if you have a son in Houston," he repeated, his voice stronger now, but strained. "A son you've never met." Addison made a sound I'd never heard from her before, a small strangled gasp that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. When I looked at her, her face had lost all its color except for 2 bright red spots on her cheeks. "Patrick, what are you talking about?" she said, but her voice sounded wrong, forced, like she was reading lines she hadn't rehearsed properly. I couldn't take my eyes off Patrick. Now that he'd said it, now that the possibility was hanging in the air between us, I could see it. The shape of his nose, the way his left eyebrow was slightly higher than his right, the same dimple in his chin that I see every morning when I shave in public restroom mirrors. "My mother's name was Sarah," Patrick said, and his voice broke on the word mother. "Sarah Kimmel. She died 3 years ago, but before she died, she told me about my father. She said his name was Charles Morrison, and that he lived in Houston when they met. She said he was kind and gentle, and that he loved to read mystery novels. I felt like I was falling, even though my feet were still on the ground. Sarah. Sweet, beautiful Sarah with her dark hair and her laugh that sounded like music. Sarah who disappeared from my life 31 years ago without explanation, without goodbye, without even a note. She loved you," Patrick continued, tears starting to form in his eyes. She talked about you all the time when I was growing up. She said you would have been a wonderful father if circumstances had been different. If circumstances had been different. The words hit me like physical blows. All these years, I thought Sarah had left because she didn't love me. I thought I'd done something wrong, said something stupid, driven her away somehow. I spent months looking for her, calling hospitals, filing missing person reports. The police told me she'd left town voluntarily. Adults had the right to disappear if they wanted to. I never knew she was pregnant. I never knew I had a son. This is impossible, Addison said, but her voice was getting higher, more desperate. Patrick, you're confused. You must be confused. But Patrick wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me with eyes that were unmistakably my own eyes, the same gray-blue that my father had, that his father had before him. "We kept pictures of you," he said. "Old ones, from when you were young." She said you were 29 when you met, working at a printing company downtown. She said you took her to see old movies at the Revival Theater on Westheimer Road. The Revival Theater. We went there every Friday night for 6 months. Sarah loved classic films, and I loved watching her face light up during the romantic scenes. I hadn't thought about those nights in years, had trained myself not to think about them because they hurt too much. She said you wanted to marry her, Patrick continued. She said you'd even picked out a ring. I had picked out a ring, a simple diamond solitaire that cost me 2 months' salary. I'd been planning to propose on her birthday. Instead, she vanished 2 weeks before, leaving only an empty apartment and a landlord who said she'd paid her rent through the end of the month and left no forwarding address. Why? The word came out before I could stop it. Why didn't she tell me? Patrick's face crumpled. She said she tried to. She said she called you, but someone told her you were engaged to someone else. She said she didn't want to ruin your happiness. Engaged to someone else. 31 years ago. I tried to remember who I might have been dating then, who might have answered my phone, but I wasn't engaged to anyone. I didn't even date anyone seriously for 3 years after Sarah left because I was still hoping she'd come back. That's impossible, I said. I wasn't engaged to anyone. I was looking for her. I was going crazy trying to find her. That's when I noticed Addison. She was backing away from us, step by step. Her purse clutched against her chest like a shield. Her face was no longer pale, it was gray. "Addison?" Patrick turned toward her, his voice questioning. "Did you know about this?" She stopped moving, caught like a deer in headlights. For a moment she looked like she might run. Then something shifted in her expression, something cold and calculating. "I think we should go," she said to Patrick. "This man is clearly unstable. He's probably making all of this up." But Patrick wasn't buying it anymore. He was studying her face the same way he'd studied mine, and I could see the exact moment when the pieces started falling into place for him. "You knew," he said, and it wasn't a question. "You knew who he was when we walked up here?" "Don't be ridiculous," Addison said, but her voice was shaking now. "How could I possibly know about some fantasy son that this homeless man claims to have?" "Because you knew my mother," Patrick said, his voice getting stronger. "You knew Sarah Kimmel." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Addison's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I thought about the timeline. 31 years ago, I was 29. Addison would have been 22. If she knew Sarah, then if she was the one who told Sarah I was engaged to someone else. "You lied to her," I said, and suddenly everything was crystal clear. "You told Sarah I was engaged to someone else." Addison's facade finally cracked completely. The mask of innocent confusion fell away, replaced by something ugly and triumphant. "So what if I did?" she snapped. She was pathetic, calling and crying about some man who probably didn't even remember her name. I did her a favor. Patrick made a sound like he'd been punched. "You destroyed my parents' lives. You destroyed my family before I was even born." "I saved you from having him as a father," Addison shot back, pointing at me with shaking fingers. "Look at him now. Look what a failure he turned out to be. Your mother was smart to stay away." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. But what shocked me more was the realization that was slowly dawning. If Addison knew Sarah 31 years ago, if she deliberately broke us up, then our marriage wasn't a coincidence. Our whole relationship was built on a lie. "How long have you known?" I asked her. How long have you known that Patrick was my son? She lifted her chin defiantly. Long enough. Patrick stepped toward her, his face white with rage. You knew who my father was and you seduced me anyway? You used me to get to him? I used you? Addison laughed, but it sounded hysterical now. You came to me, remember? You're the one who was looking for your father. I just helped things along. The truth hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't fallen in love with a younger man. She'd orchestrated this entire thing. The divorce, the humiliation, even this moment, right now, all of it was planned. You destroyed my life to get revenge on a woman who's been dead for 3 years, I said. I destroyed your life because you deserved it, she spat. Both of you. Sarah thought she was so special, so pure, and you thought you were some kind of romantic hero. Well, look how that turned out. Patrick was staring at her with an expression of complete horror. This wasn't just about discovering his father. This was about discovering that the woman he'd been involved with had manipulated him from the very beginning. How could you do this, he whispered. But Addison wasn't done. She was on a roll now, years of carefully contained bitterness pouring out all at once. Do you want to know the best part? She said, her voice rising. Sarah died thinking you'd abandoned her. She never knew the truth. She went to her grave believing that the great love of her life couldn't be bothered to call her back. That's when Patrick snapped. His hand moved so fast I almost didn't see it, but Addison did. She flinched, expecting to be struck. Instead, Patrick just pointed at her, his whole arm shaking with rage. Get away from us, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Get away from us right now, or I swear to God, I'll do something we'll all regret. For the first time since I'd known her, Addison looked genuinely afraid. She took another step back, then another. This isn't over, she said, but her voice had lost all its venom. She sounded small now, defeated. Yes, it is, Patrick said. Whatever we had, whatever you thought we had, it's over. Don't call me. Don't come to my apartment. Don't ever contact me again. Addison opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, but then she seemed to think better of it. She turned and walked away, her high heels clicking against the pavement. She didn't look back. Patrick and I stood there in the alley behind the restaurant, watching her disappear around the corner. When she was gone, he turned to me, and I saw that he was crying. I'm sorry, he said. I'm so sorry for what she did to you, to both of you. I wanted to comfort him, but I didn't know how. This was my son, but he was also a stranger. 31 years of missed birthdays and Christmas mornings and bedtime stories stretched between us like a canyon I didn't know how to cross. It's not your fault, I told him. None of this is your fault. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. I used to do the same thing when I was his age. What do we do now? He asked. I didn't have an answer. I was still homeless, still broke, still standing in an alley that smelled like garbage and broken dreams. Finding out I had a son didn't change any of that. But for the first time in 18 months, I felt something besides despair. I felt hope. I don't know, I said honestly. But maybe we could start by talking. We ended up at a coffee shop 6 blocks away from the alley where my life changed forever. Patrick insisted on paying, and I felt the familiar sting of shame as I watched him pull out a leather wallet that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. But this was different from the shame I'd felt with Addison. This wasn't mockery. This was my son trying to take care of me. The coffee shop was one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and baristas who looked like they belonged in art school. I felt out of place in my stained clothes and 3-day stubble, but Patrick didn't seem to notice. He chose a corner table away from the other customers, and I was grateful for the privacy. Tell me about her, Patrick said once we'd settled in with our drinks. His coffee was some elaborate creation with foam art on top. Mine was black, bitter, and the most delicious thing I'd tasted in weeks. Tell me about my mother. Where do you start when someone asks you to resurrect a ghost? How do you explain a love that happened over 3 decades ago to the child that love created without your knowledge? Sarah was 24 when we met, I began, wrapping my hands around the warm coffee cup. I was working at Morrison Printing. It was my father's company then, before I sold it after he died. She came in with a manuscript she wanted bound. She was trying to become a writer. Patrick's eyes lit up. She never stopped writing. Even when she was sick, she kept notebooks by her bed. The thought of Sarah writing until the very end made my chest tight. What did she write about? Everything. Stories, poems, letters she never sent. He paused, looking down at his coffee. A lot of letters to you. I had to swallow hard before I could continue. She had this way of seeing beauty in ordinary things. She'd notice how the light hit a building at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, or how the sound of rain on different surfaces created music. She made me see the world differently. She used to say that, Patrick said quietly. She'd tell me stories about a man who taught her to notice the small miracles around us. I always wondered if she was making him up. We were together for 8 months, I continued. Every Friday night was movie night at the Revival Theater. Sundays we'd drive out to Galveston and walk on the beach. She collected seashells, said each one had its own story. I could see her so clearly in my memory, bent over in the sand, examining shells with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Her dark hair would fall across her face, and she'd tuck it behind her ear with fingers that were always slightly ink-stained from her writing. She loved old movies, Patrick said. Casablanca was her favorite. We must have seen it 5 times, I said, smiling despite everything. She cried every single time, even though she knew how it ended. She had all the dialogue memorized. Sometimes when I was little, she'd act out scenes for me. She'd be Ingrid Bergman, and I'd have to be Humphrey Bogart. The image of young Patrick being coached through Casablanca by Sarah made something inside my chest crack open. All those years of being a father I'd missed. All those moments that should have been mine. I was going to propose, I said, the words coming out rougher than I intended. I had the ring and everything, a solitaire diamond, 1 carat from Miller's Jewelry downtown, cost me $2,000, which was a fortune back then. Patrick's face fell. She told me about the ring. She said she dreamed about it sometimes. I was waiting for her birthday, March 15th. I had it all planned. Dinner at Antonio's, the place where we had our first date, then a walk by the bayou where we'd shared our first kiss. I practiced the speech for weeks. What happened? I took a shaky breath. She disappeared 2 weeks before her birthday. I went to her apartment, and the landlord said she'd paid through the month and left. No forwarding address, no explanation. Her phone was disconnected. She said she tried to call you, Patrick said. She said someone told her you were engaged. The words hung between us like an accusation. Someone. We both knew who that someone was. I was never engaged to anyone else, I said firmly. After Sarah left, I couldn't even look at another woman for 3 years. I kept thinking she'd come back, that there was some misunderstanding. You never knew that. She died thinking you'd moved on without her. The cruelty of it hit me fresh. Sarah had spent 31 years believing I'd abandoned her, while I'd spent the same 31 years believing she'd abandoned me. And the woman responsible for that lie had then systematically destroyed my life. Tell me about Addison, Patrick said, as if reading my thoughts. How did you meet her? I had to think about that. The early days with Addison seemed like they'd happened to someone else. It was about 8 years after Sarah disappeared. I was 37, finally starting to date again. Addison was 29, working at a marketing firm downtown. She seemed interested in my business, asked lots of questions about the printing company. What kinds of questions? Financial ones, mostly. How much the company was worth, whether I had any debt, what my plans were for expansion. At the time, I'd thought she was just trying to understand my work. Now I wondered if she'd been calculating my net worth. She pursued me pretty aggressively, I continued. Flowers at my office, surprise lunches, tickets to shows I'd mentioned wanting to see. I was flattered. I hadn't had a woman pay that much attention to me since Sarah. Patrick was quiet for a long moment, processing this. How long before you got married? 2 years. She said she wanted a long engagement to plan the perfect wedding. I laughed bitterly. The perfect wedding cost $43,000. I should have seen the warning signs then. What warning signs? Everything had to be exactly as she envisioned it. The flowers, the music, the guest list. When my cousin brought his new girlfriend, someone Addison hadn't met, she had them seated at a table in the back corner like they were unwelcome relatives. She said the wedding photos couldn't include anyone who didn't fit her aesthetic. I remembered feeling uncomfortable about it at the time, but I'd told myself that brides were supposed to be particular about their weddings. I'd made excuses for behavior that should have alarmed me. The marriage was good at first, I continued, or I thought it was. Addison was charming, social, great at entertaining my business clients. She transformed our house into something from a magazine. Everything was beautiful and perfect and cold. When did things change? Gradually. She started commenting on my clothes, saying I dressed like an old man. She'd invite friends over and make jokes about my age, my habits, my interests, always with a smile, always followed by, "I'm just teasing, honey." But it wore me down. Patrick's jaw was tight. He was grooming you. For what? For this, for making you believe you deserve to lose everything. The truth of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Addison hadn't just taken my money and my house. She'd systematically destroyed my self-worth until I believed I deserved to be destroyed. "When did you lose your job?" Patrick asked. 15 months ago. The printing industry has been struggling for years, but we were holding on. Then suddenly our biggest client canceled their contract, then another. Within 6 months, I had to close the company and lay off 8 employees who'd been with me for years. That must have been devastating. It was. Those people were like family to me. Some of them had worked for my father before they worked for me. Letting them go was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I paused, remembering the looks on their faces when I'd called that final meeting. Addison said it proved I was a failure as a businessman. What did she do while you were looking for work? Nothing. She said she needed to focus on her own career, that she couldn't be expected to support both of us. But she never took a job. She spent her days shopping, having lunch with friends, getting spa treatments. The bills kept coming, and she kept spending. How did you pay for everything? I liquidated my retirement accounts, took out loans against the house. I kept thinking I'd find work soon, that things would turn around. But every job interview seemed to go wrong. Potential employers would call references and suddenly lose interest. I started to think I was cursed. Patrick's expression darkened. Or sabotaged. The possibility had never occurred to me. But now it seemed obvious. Addison had connections in the business community. She could have easily poisoned potential employers against me. The divorce came 8 months after I lost the job, I continued. She said she couldn't watch me fail anymore, that she deserved better than a man who couldn't provide for his family. Her lawyer had documentation of every financial mistake I'd made, every bad decision, every sign that I was unstable. But you weren't unstable. I was depressed, desperate. I made some poor choices trying to keep us afloat, but the picture they painted in court, it was like they were describing a completely different person. Because they were creating a completely different person. They were creating the narrative they needed to take everything from you. I thought about the divorce proceedings, how prepared Addison's team had been, how they'd had answers for every question before it was asked, how they'd presented evidence of financial irresponsibility that I barely remembered creating. She planned this, I said, the full scope of it finally becoming clear. From the very beginning, she planned to destroy me. But why? Patrick asked. What did you do to deserve this? I looked at my son, this man I'd never known existed until 2 hours ago, and saw my own confusion reflected in his eyes. I loved your mother, I said simply. That's all I did wrong. I loved Sarah Kimmel, and somehow, that was unforgivable. Patrick was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee like it might hold answers. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. She used me, he said quietly. Addison used me to hurt you, and she used you to hurt my mother. Even after Mom was dead, she was still finding ways to hurt her. How did you meet Addison? I asked, though I was dreading the answer. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago to find my father. Mom had given me just enough information to start with. Your name, the city where you'd lived, the name of your company. The investigator found you pretty quickly, but he also found information about your divorce, your bankruptcy, your current situation. And Addison? She contacted me. Patrick's voice was hollow. She said she'd heard I was looking for Charles Morrison, that she was your ex-wife and might be able to help. She said you were a good man who'd fallen on hard times, that she felt terrible, about how things had ended between you. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Addison had positioned herself as the concerned ex-wife, the woman who wanted to help reunite a father and son, and Patrick, desperate to find his father, had walked right into her trap. She said she thought it would be better if we got to know each other first, Patrick continued, before I contacted you directly. She said you'd been through a lot and might not be ready for such a big surprise. How long were you together? 3 months. 3 months of her telling me stories about you, preparing me for how broken you'd become. She made it sound like she was protecting me from disappointment, but she was really protecting herself from discovery. And she was savoring it, Patrick said, anger creeping into his voice. She was enjoying every minute of being close to your son while you suffered. She was getting revenge on a dead woman by hurting her child and the man she loved. The scope of Addison's cruelty was staggering. She hadn't just destroyed my marriage and my finances. She'd orchestrated a psychological torture that spanned decades and involved people who had never even met her. I'm sorry, I said, though the words felt inadequate. I'm sorry she used you. I'm sorry you got caught up in something that started before you were even born. Patrick reached across the table and touched my hand. His fingers were warm, strong, real. You don't have anything to apologize for. We're both victims here. But even as he said it, I could see the wheels turning in his mind. This wasn't just about victimhood anymore. This was about justice. And Patrick, I was beginning to realize, had inherited more than just my eyes. He'd inherited my stubborn streak, too. Patrick drove me to a hotel that night. Not a fancy one, but clean and safe, with walls that didn't smell like mold and sheets that had been washed. I tried to protest, but he wouldn't hear it. You're not sleeping on the street anymore, he said firmly. Not while I'm alive. I sat on the edge of the bed after he left, staring at my reflection in the mirror across the room. For the first time in 18 months, I looked like a human being instead of a ghost. The shower had washed away layers of grime and shame I'd been carrying. Patrick had also bought me clothes. Nothing fancy, just jeans and a button-down shirt from Target, but they fit and they were mine. He'd given me his phone number and promised to call the next day. I'd written it down on the hotel notepad and read it over and over, still not quite believing any of this was real. I had a son. After 63 years of believing I'd never be a father, I had a 30-year-old son who looked like me and had his mother's kindness. But I also knew that Addison wouldn't give up easily. She'd spent too many years orchestrating my destruction to let it unravel. Because of one chance encounter, whatever she was planning next, it would be worse than anything she'd done before. I was right. Patrick called me at 7 in the morning. I could hear the tension in his voice immediately. We need to meet, he said. I found something bad. We met at the same coffee shop as the day before. Patrick looked like he hadn't slept. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was carrying a manila folder thick with papers. I couldn't stop thinking about what Addison said yesterday. He began without preamble. About my mother trying to call you, about someone telling her you were engaged. So I went through Mom's things. He opened the folder and pulled out a shoebox. She kept everything. Every letter, every photograph, every piece of paper that mattered to her. I'd gone through it after she died, but yesterday I looked at it differently. The first thing he showed me was a photograph I hadn't seen in over 30 years. It was me at 28, standing in front of the Revival Theater, grinning at whoever was behind the camera. Sarah, I realized. Sarah had taken this picture. She kept this in her wallet, Patrick said quietly. For 31 years, she carried your picture in her wallet. The emotion that hit me was so strong, I couldn't speak. I just stared at the young man in the photograph, remembering how hopeful he'd been, how sure he was that love conquered everything. But look at this, Patrick continued, pulling out a small address book. The pages were yellow with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. This was my mother's phone book from 1992. Look at the entry for Charles Morrison. I looked. There was my old address on Elm Street, my work number at the printing company, and my home phone number. But there was something else, a notation in different ink, clearly added later. Engaged to A. Whitmore. Don't call. The handwriting wasn't Sarah's. It was too neat, too controlled. And the name, A. Whitmore, hit me like a punch to the stomach. Addison's maiden name was Whitmore, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know. I looked her up. Patrick's face was grim. But that's not the worst part. Look at this. He pulled out a letter, carefully unfolded, and obviously read many times. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, with letterhead that read, Whitmore and Associates Marketing. Dear Miss Kimmel, I read aloud. Thank you for your inquiry regarding Charles Morrison. I can confirm that Mr. Morrison is currently engaged to be married to Miss Addison Whitmore. The wedding is planned for this fall. Mr. Morrison has asked that his former acquaintances respect his privacy during this happy time. Sincerely, Addison Whitmore, Account Executive. I read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit me. This wasn't just a case of Addison lying to Sarah over the phone. This was premeditated, calculated destruction. She'd created official letterhead, crafted a formal response, and mailed it to a pregnant woman who was desperately trying to reach the father of her child. The date on this letter, Patrick said, his voice shaking with anger, March 1st, 1992. 2 weeks before my mother's birthday. 2 weeks before you were planning to propose. I felt sick. She knew exactly when to strike. But how did she know about my mother at all? How did she know you were planning to propose? I thought back to that time, trying to remember if I'd mentioned Sarah to anyone. Then it hit me. The ring, I said. Miller's jewelry. I bought the ring from Miller's and they had to size it. I told them it was for my girlfriend Sarah Kimmel, gave them her address in case they needed to contact her for the sizing. And Addison worked in marketing. She would have had access to client lists, vendor information. She must have been monitoring jewelry stores, looking for men buying engagement rings. When she found my order, she saw an opportunity. The calculated nature of it was breathtaking. Addison had systematically researched my relationship, identified the perfect moment to destroy it, and then executed her plan with corporate efficiency. There's more, Patrick said grimly. He pulled out another document, this one more recent. I found this in her apartment yesterday when I went to get my things. It was a bank statement from 6 months ago, showing a payment of $5,000 to something called Meridian Investigations. I called them, Patrick said. They're a private investigation firm, the same firm I used to find you. The implications hit me immediately. She hired them to find you before you hired them to find me. 6 months ago, right around the time I started looking for my father, somehow she knew I was searching. She got to the investigators first. I stared at the bank statement, my mind racing. So, when you hired them, they were already working for her. Everything they told me, every piece of information about you, she controlled. She knew about your divorce, your financial problems, your homelessness. She knew I was your son before I ever contacted her. She orchestrated the entire thing, including having you meet her. Patrick nodded, his face pale. The investigator I thought I hired called me yesterday after you and I met. He said Addison had contacted him this morning, furious that her plan had fallen apart. She admitted everything to him, how she'd been paying him to feed me information, how she'd planned to slowly reveal that you were my father after she'd completely destroyed your life. She wanted you to see me at my lowest point. She wanted me to see you as a failure. She wanted me to be disgusted by what you'd become, to reject you the way she believed you'd rejected my mother. Patrick's hands were shaking now. She was going to let me watch you suffer, maybe even participate in that suffering, and then reveal who I was. The ultimate revenge, having your own son witness your destruction. The cruelty of it was beyond anything I could have imagined. Addison hadn't just wanted to hurt me. She'd wanted to corrupt my relationship with my son before it could even begin. But that's still not the worst part, Patrick said. He reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a document that made my blood freeze. It was a copy of Sarah's death certificate, cause of death, complications from ovarian cancer. But there was a note attached in Addison's handwriting. Received notification from Houston General Hospital February 15th. SK asking for Charles Morrison in her final days. Did not forward message. I couldn't breathe. The words swam in front of my eyes as the full horror of what I was reading sank in. "She was asking for you," Patrick whispered. "My mother was dying, and she was asking for you. The hospital tried to contact you, but they called your old number. When they couldn't reach you directly, they called information and got transferred to Addison because she's listed as your emergency contact in some old records. Addison knew Sarah was dying and chose not to tell me. She let my mother die believing you didn't care enough to come, and she let you live not knowing that the woman you loved was dying and wanted to see you one last time." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Several other customers turned to look, but I didn't care. I needed air, space, somewhere to put the rage that was building inside me like pressure in a boiler. Patrick followed me outside, where I stood on the sidewalk, gasping like I'd been underwater. The morning traffic rushed past us, normal people going to normal jobs, living normal lives that didn't include the kind of calculated evil I'd just discovered. "She stole everything," I said when I could finally speak. "Not just my money or my house. She stole 31 years of my life. She stole my chance to be your father. She stole Sarah's last days and my chance to say goodbye." "I know," Patrick said quietly, "and she's not done yet." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean she thinks she's lost control of the situation, and Addison doesn't handle loss of control well. She's going to try to regain it." As if summoned by his words, my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I knew who it was before I answered. "Hello, Charles." Addison's voice was silk over steel. "I think we need to talk. I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, but I have so much to say to you." "About Patrick? About his poor, dead mother? About some very interesting documents that I'm sure the police would find fascinating?" "What are you talking about? Patrick didn't tell you about his mother's life insurance policy, did he? The one worth $200,000 that she left to him? The one that required her to prove his paternity before he could collect?" I looked at Patrick, who had gone pale. "You see, Charles, your son has been quite desperate to find his father. Desperate enough to forge some documents, perhaps? Desperate enough to create a false narrative about being your child to claim his inheritance." "That's not true," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to me. "Isn't it? A homeless man, a young man with money problems, and a convenient story about being long-lost family? I'm sure a jury would find it very interesting indeed." I could hear the smile in her voice, the satisfaction of a trap well laid. "Meet me tonight at 8 o'clock. The parking garage behind the Marriott downtown, 3rd floor. Come alone, or I make some very damaging phone calls about insurance fraud and elder abuse." The line went dead. Patrick was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "What did she say?" I told him, watching his face grow paler with each word. "The insurance policy is real," he said quietly. $200,000. And yes, I had to prove paternity to collect it. But I had DNA tests done on things my mother kept of yours. Hair from an old brush, saliva from letters you'd licked closed. Everything was legitimate. But she can make it look suspicious. She can make anything look suspicious. That's what she does. I looked at this young man who was my son, this stranger who was my flesh and blood, and I realized that Addison had succeeded in creating doubt between us, even in victory. Even now, even knowing what she was, part of me wondered if Patrick was exactly who he claimed to be. And if I was thinking that, what would a jury think? "We have to meet her," I said. "It's a trap." "I know, but it's the only way this ends." Patrick nodded slowly. "Then we meet her together." She said to come alone. She said a lot of things. Most of them were lies. Patrick's jaw was set with determination that reminded me of his mother. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." That night, as we drove toward what might be our final confrontation with the woman who had destroyed so many lives, I realized something. Addison had made one crucial mistake in all her planning. She'd assumed that learning the truth would tear Patrick and me apart. Instead, it had brought us together. And together we were stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and concrete, empty except for a few scattered cars on the 3rd floor. Our footsteps echoed in the hollow space as Patrick and I walked toward the corner where Addison had told me to meet her. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, But beside me, Patrick moved with a calm determination that steadied my nerves. We found her leaning against a black BMW, arms crossed, looking like she was posing for a magazine spread, even in a concrete tomb. She was wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people made in a week, and her makeup was flawless, despite the harsh fluorescent lighting. "I told you to come alone," she said when she saw Patrick. "And I told you I was done taking orders from you," Patrick replied evenly. Addison's smile was razor-sharp. How touching. Father and son, united at last. Sarah would be so proud. The way she said Sarah's name, with mockery and contempt, made something dark unfurl in my chest. This woman had tortured a dying woman by withholding the one thing she'd wanted most in her final days. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "What do you want, Addison?" I asked. "What I've always wanted. Justice." She pushed off from the car and began walking in a slow circle around us. "Do you know what it was like, Charles, watching Sarah float through life, thinking she was some kind of romantic heroine, watching her write poetry about true love and soulmates, while real women like me had to work for everything we got?" "You were jealous of her," Patrick said, and it wasn't a question. "Jealous?" Addison laughed, but there was nothing humorous about the sound. I was realistic. Sarah lived in a fantasy world where love conquered all and good things happened to good people. I lived in the real world where money mattered and connections mattered, and pretty stories about soulmates didn't pay the bills. "So you destroyed her life," I said. I gave her a reality check, and when that didn't work, I decided to give you one too. She stopped walking and fixed me with a stare that could have frozen water. 12 years, Charles. 12 years I spent married to you, playing the perfect wife, waiting for the right moment. The right moment for what? To show you what real loss felt like. To make you understand what Sarah went through when she thought you'd abandoned her. Addison's voice was rising now, passion breaking through her controlled facade. She died thinking you didn't love her enough to call her back. She died broken-hearted and alone, and I wanted you to know exactly how that felt. "But I never abandoned her," I said, my own voice getting louder. "You stole that from both of us. You stole 31 years that we could have had together." "You would have been miserable together," Addison snapped. "Sarah was weak. She would have dragged you down just like she dragged down everyone who tried to help her. At least I made something of myself." "You made yourself into a monster," Patrick said quietly, and the simple truth of it seemed to hit Addison like a physical blow. For a moment her composure cracked completely. Her face twisted with something ugly. Rage, pain, maybe even recognition of what she'd become. But then she gathered herself, smoothing her expression back into cold control. "Call it whatever you want," she said. "But I won. Sarah is dead. Charles is destroyed. And I have everything I ever wanted." "Do you?" Patrick asked. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like you're alone in a parking garage, threatening people because your entire life is built on lies." "I'm not alone," Addison said, but her voice wavered slightly. "I have friends, connections, a social circle that what? Respects you? Loves you?" Patrick shook his head. "You don't have any real relationships, Addison. You have transactions. People who tolerate you because you're useful to them." "And what do you have?" she shot back. "A homeless father and a dead mother's memory? At least my relationships are based on reality." "They're based on fear and manipulation," I said. "Just like our marriage was." "Our marriage was the best thing that ever happened to you," Addison said. "I turned you into something respectable. I gave you a social life, business connections, a beautiful home. Without me, you were just a sad middle-aged man pining for a woman who didn't want you." "She did want me," I said firmly. "She wanted me until the day she died. And you knew that, which is why you worked so hard to keep us apart. I saved you from a lifetime of disappointment. You stole a lifetime of happiness." Addison opened her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "None of that matters now. What matters is that I have documented proof that Patrick here has been running a long-term con to defraud an insurance company. Fake DNA tests, forged documents, elaborate stories about being your long-lost son." "The DNA tests were real," Patrick said. "Were they? Because I have a very different story to tell. About a desperate young man who researched Charles Morrison thoroughly, learned about his past relationship with Sarah Kimmel, and decided to exploit that information for financial gain. She pulled papers from the envelope and held them up. "I have records of Patrick researching Charles online months before he claimed to hire that private investigator. I have evidence that he specifically sought out information about Sarah's death and her insurance policy. I have documentation showing that he created false identification to gain access to medical records he had no legal right to see." My heart sank. Even if the evidence was fabricated, it would be convincing enough to cast doubt on everything Patrick had told me. "And the beautiful part," Addison continued, "is that Charles is the perfect mark. A homeless man with no resources to fight back, no credibility with authorities, no way to verify his side of the story. Who's going to believe him over documented evidence?" "People who know the truth," Patrick said. "Us what people?" "The private investigator who's already signed an affidavit stating that he believes Patrick manipulated him into providing false information. The hospital workers who can testify that Patrick was unusually persistent in trying to access his mother's medical records. The insurance company that's already flagged his claim as suspicious." I stared at her, understanding the full scope of what she'd accomplished. She hadn't just planned my destruction, she'd planned Patrick's too. She'd spent months creating a false narrative that would destroy both of us if we tried to fight back. "You planned this from the beginning," I said. "When Patrick first contacted you, you saw an opportunity to hurt both of us." "I saw an opportunity to finish what I started 31 years ago," Addison corrected. "Sarah thought she could have her fairy tale ending through her son. I'm making sure that doesn't happen." "What do you want?" Patrick asked. "I want you to disappear from Charles's life," Addison said. "I want you to admit that you made up this entire story about being his son. And I want Charles to publicly acknowledge that he was wrong to make false accusations about our marriage. And if we refuse, then I file reports with the police, the insurance company, and the district attorney's office. Patrick goes to prison for fraud, and Charles gets investigated for conspiracy. Either way, you both lose everything." Off. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the rapid beating of my own heart. Addison had us trapped, and she knew it. But then Patrick did something unexpected. He laughed. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said, still chuckling. "You're so focused on destroying us that you forgot something important." "What's that?" "You're not the only one who knows how to plan ahead." Patrick reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. He held it up so Addison could see the red light indicating it was still recording. "Everything you just said about fabricating evidence, framing me for insurance fraud, planning my mother's emotional torture for 31 years. It's all right here." Addison's face went white. "You can't use that. I didn't consent to being recorded." "Actually, in Texas, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation." I consented. And this conversation just became evidence of conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and probably a dozen other felonies. "You little—" Addison lunged toward Patrick, trying to grab the recorder, but I stepped between them. "Don't," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Don't touch my son." Addison backed off, but her eyes were wild now, desperate. "You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. I have connections, resources, lawyers who will bury you both in paperwork and legal fees until you wish you'd never been born." "Maybe," Patrick said, "but you know what you don't have?" "What?" "The truth. And eventually, the truth has a way of winning out." For the first time since I'd known her, Addison looked truly defeated. The mask of control she'd worn for so long was cracking, revealing the frightened, bitter woman underneath. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I said. "For the first time in 31 years, this is finally over." Addison looked back and forth between Patrick and me, searching for some angle, some way to regain control of the situation, but there wasn't one. Her carefully constructed plan had finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. "You'll regret this," she said, backing toward her car. "Both of you. You'll regret crossing me." "The only thing I regret," I said, "is the 12 years I wasted believing you actually loved me." Addison's face crumpled at that, as if I'd hit her with something she wasn't expecting. For just a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine pain in her eyes. But then she gathered herself, climbed into her BMW, and drove away without another word. Patrick and I stood in the empty parking garage, listening to the echo of her engine fade into the distance. The recorder was still running in his hand, preserving every word of her confession for posterity. "Is it really over?" I asked. Patrick turned off the recorder and slipped it back into his pocket. "The part where she has power over us, yes, that's over." "And the other part? The part where we figure out how to be father and son after 31 years? Patrick smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked truly relaxed. "That part is just beginning." As we walked back to his car, I realized that Addison had been wrong about one crucial thing. She'd assumed that revenge was the most powerful force in the world, that the desire to hurt others could overcome anything. But she'd never understood that love, real love, the kind Sarah had felt for me and I had felt for her, was stronger than revenge. It was strong enough to survive 31 years of separation, strong enough to create a bond between a father and son who had never met, strong enough to defeat even the most carefully planned cruelty. Addison had spent 3 decades trying to prove that love was an illusion, that in the end, only power and money mattered. Instead, she'd proven exactly the opposite. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of a small apartment in downtown Houston, making coffee and watching the morning sun stream through windows that actually belonged to me. The apartment wasn't much, 800 square feet, a view of the parking lot, furniture from thrift stores, and garage sales. But it was mine. After 18 months of having nothing, owning even this modest space felt like a miracle. Patrick had wanted to put me up somewhere nicer, but I'd insisted on earning my way back. I was working again, managing a small print shop that specialized in wedding invitations and business cards. The pay wasn't much, $12 an hour, but it was honest work that used skills I'd spent a lifetime developing. More importantly, it was giving me back something I'd lost, my dignity. The legal battle with Addison had been swift and decisive. The recording Patrick made in the parking garage, combined with all the evidence we'd gathered about her 31-year campaign of manipulation, had been enough to convince the district attorney to file charges. Extortion, fraud, conspiracy, the list went on. Her high-powered lawyers had negotiated a plea deal that included restitution and 5 years of probation, but more importantly, it had cleared Patrick and me of any wrongdoing. The insurance company had paid out Sarah's policy without further question. Patrick had used most of that money to establish a small foundation that provided grants to single mothers pursuing education, something he said his mother would have wanted. But he'd set aside enough to help me get back on my feet, and despite my protests, he'd insisted. "It's not charity," he'd said when I tried to refuse. "It's an investment in our future. Our future." I was still getting used to having a future that included another person, especially one who shared my DNA, but was essentially a stranger. We were learning each other slowly, carefully, like two people sharing a language neither of us spoke fluently. I'd learned that Patrick was a software engineer who worked mostly with nonprofits and small businesses. He'd inherited Sarah's love of old movies and her habit of collecting interesting rocks and shells. He was quieter than I was, more thoughtful. But when something made him laugh, his whole face lit up in a way that reminded me so strongly of his mother, it sometimes took my breath away. He'd learned that I was more resilient than either of us had expected, that losing everything had taught me to appreciate simple things like hot coffee and clean sheets. He'd discovered that I remembered every detail Sarah had ever shared with me, and that talking about her wasn't painful, it was healing. We had dinner together every Sunday, a tradition we'd started the week after the confrontation with Addison. Sometimes we cooked, sometimes we ordered takeout, but we always talked. About Sarah, about the years we'd lost, about the life we were building together now. Today was different, though. Today was special. Patrick arrived at noon carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the kind of nervous smile I was beginning to recognize. He got that expression when he was about to share something important. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward the package. "Something I've been waiting to give you," he said. "But I wanted to wait until the right time." And this is the right time? It's March 15th. It would have been Mom's 66th birthday. My chest tightened. Sarah's birthday. The day I'd planned to propose to her all those years ago. Patrick had remembered. He handed me the package, and I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, handcrafted and beautiful, with Sarah's initials carved into the lid. When I opened it, my breath caught. It was full of letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to me in Sarah's familiar handwriting. The paper was yellowed with age, and some of the ink had faded, but they were clearly preserved with love. "She wrote to you," Patrick said quietly. "For 31 years, she wrote you letters. Birthdays, holidays, random Tuesday afternoons, when she missed you too much to concentrate on anything else. She never sent them, but she never stopped writing them." I picked up the top letter with trembling hands. It was dated March 15th, 1992, her birthday, the day I'd planned to propose, 2 weeks after she'd received Addison's cruel letter. "My dearest Charles," I read aloud, my voice breaking on the words. "Today is my birthday, and all I can think about is that somewhere you're celebrating your engagement to someone else. I should hate you, but I can't. I can only hope that she makes you as happy as you made me." I had to stop reading. The letter shook in my hands as tears I'd been holding back for 6 months finally spilled over. "She never stopped loving you," Patrick said. "Even when she thought you'd abandoned her, even when she was dying, she never stopped loving you." I set the letter down and picked up another one, this one dated 5 years later. In it, Sarah wrote about Patrick's first day of kindergarten, how he'd been brave and excited, and how she'd wished I could have been there to see him off. Another letter, from 10 years later, described Patrick's high school graduation and how proud she was of the young man he was becoming. "There are letters about me in here," I said, wonder in my voice. "Hundreds of them. She told you about every milestone, every achievement, every moment when she looked at me and saw you." Patrick's own voice was thick with emotion. "She raised me with stories about my father, about the kind of man you were, about how much she believed you would have loved me if you'd known I existed." I picked up a letter from near the bottom of the box, dated just 2 months before Sarah's death. The handwriting was shakier, clearly written by someone who was very ill, but the words were clear. "Charles, I know I'm dying, and I know you'll never read this, but I need to tell you something. Patrick is looking for you. He's hired investigators, and I think he might actually find you. When he does, please don't blame him for the choices I made. I kept him from you not because I didn't trust you to be a good father, but because I thought you were happy without us. If I was wrong, if you would have wanted to know about him, then I'm sorrier than you'll ever know. Love him for me. Love him the way I always knew you would. All my love, Sarah." I closed the letter and sat in silence for a long moment, overwhelmed by the weight of 31 years of unspoken love. All this time, I'd thought Sarah had forgotten me, moved on, built a life that didn't include any memory of what we'd shared. Instead, she'd carried me with her every single day. "She knew," I said finally. "At the end, she knew you might find me. She gave me these letters a week before she died. She said if I ever found you, I should wait until I was sure you wanted a relationship with me before I gave them to you." Patrick smiled through his tears. "I'm sure now. I looked at this young man who was my son, this gift Sarah had given me without my knowledge, this second chance I'd never expected to receive. 31 years ago, Addison had destroyed my first chance at happiness. But she'd failed to understand that love isn't destroyed by separation, or lies, or even death. It endures. It waits. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it finds its way back to you." "I want to show you something," I said, getting up and walking to the small desk in the corner of my living room. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small velvet box I'd kept for over 3 decades. Patrick's eyes widened when he saw it. "Is that the engagement ring I bought for your mother?" I opened the box to reveal the diamond solitaire, still bright and beautiful after all these years. I kept it even through the divorce, even when I had to sell everything else. I could never bring myself to get rid of it. Why? Because it represented the only real love I'd ever known, yeah, and I guess, somewhere deep down, I always hoped I'd find a way to give it to her someday. I closed the box and handed it to Patrick. I can't give it to your mother now, but I can give it to you. Maybe someday you'll find someone you love the way I loved Sarah. Someone worth waiting 31 years for." Patrick took the box with reverence, holding it like the precious thing it was. She would have said yes, you know. If you'd been able to propose to her, she would have said yes. How do you know? Because she told me in one of the letters. She said the only regret she had about leaving was that she never got to marry the love of her life. We sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had survived 3 decades of separation. Outside, the city of Houston went about its business, unaware that in a small apartment downtown, a father and son were finally healing wounds that had been 31 years in the making. Later that evening, we drove to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. It was a simple grave with a modest headstone, but Patrick had planted flowers around it that were beginning to bloom in the spring warmth. I knelt and placed one of her letters on the stone, weighted down with a small rock so the wind wouldn't take it. "I know you can't hear me," I said quietly, "but I wanted to tell you something. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day in 31 years. And I want you to know that Patrick is the most extraordinary young man I've ever met. You raised him to be kind and strong and good, and you should be proud." Patrick knelt beside me and placed his hand on the headstone. "I found him, Mom. I found Dad, and he's exactly the man you said he would be." As we stood to leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something stronger than pain. Love that had survived betrayal, separation, and even death. Love that had created a bridge between a father and son across 3 decades of lost time. Addison had spent 31 years trying to prove that love was an illusion, that cruelty was stronger than kindness, that revenge was more satisfying than forgiveness. In the end, she'd proven exactly the opposite. Love had won. It always did, if you were patient enough to wait for it. That night, I called Patrick from my apartment to thank him for the letters, for the ring ceremony, for giving me back a piece of Sarah I'd never known I'd lost. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "We're family. That's what family does. Family." After 63 years of believing I'd never have one, I finally understood what the word really meant. It wasn't about blood or genetics or shared history. It was about choosing to love someone despite their flaws, despite the lost time, despite all the ways the world tried to tear you apart. I'd lost a wife, a home, and a fortune. But I'd gained something infinitely more valuable: a son who chose to love me not because he had to, but because he wanted to. A son who carried his mother's heart and his father's stubborn hope for tomorrow. I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge against those who try to destroy you isn't fighting back. It's building something beautiful from the ashes they leave behind. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, love really does find a way home.